Hello and welcome to this online course on continuum mechanics for undergraduates. My name is Gaurav Bhutani and I'm a lecturer at IIT Mandi. These lectures on continuum mechanics are recorded as part of Institute Core course that is called IC 242, which is typically offered to second year undergraduates at IIT Mandi. This course is going to give you background to understand mechanics of solids and fluids along with a strong foundation of basic tensor algebra. A couple of words about myself. So I've done my BTech and MTech degree from IIT Kanpur. Post that I've got 5 years of industrial experience, which includes metal mining. Yes, I've made my hands dirty. Data analytics, finance and academic research, followed by a PhD and postdoc at Imperial College London, which was mainly in the field of fluid mechanics. And then I've been working as an assistant professor for the last 3.5 years at IIT Mandi. At IIT Mandi, I head the multi-phase flow research lab, which focuses on 3 major applications. One is called particle laden flow. So this has applications in industrial reactors. The second one is in granular flows with a particular focus on avalanche dynamics. And the third one is in the field of microfluidics, particularly the reward application. We also use a lot of high performance scientific computing in our group. So this includes high performance computing clusters, and we sometimes have to go to the field to collect research data. At IIT Mandi, I've been teaching this course on continuum mechanics for the last few years. Other than that, I've taught advanced fluid mechanics, which is primarily viscous flow theory. I've also taught a course on high performance scientific computing. This covers parallel programming using MPI and OpenMP. Some programming methodologies such as version control systems, makefiles and Python scripting. I've also taught heat transfer for undergraduates and a course on computational fluid dynamics, which particularly includes finite difference methods and finite volume methods. For this course on continuum mechanics, all you will need is high school mechanics. I'm sure everybody has a background on that. You'll also need some basic understanding of vector calculus and linear algebra. So if you are a second year undergraduate, then you should have no problems understanding this course. In terms of the text for this course, I'll be sharing my course notes on the course website. Along with that, we'll be following the book by Mace and Mace. This book is called Continuum Mechanics for Engineers. We'll be looking at particularly the second edition. So please note that there's a third edition available as well, but there's a lot of notational differences, and the one we'll be following is going to be the second edition. I will share with you reading assignments from time to time, so you can go to my website and have a look at the reading assignments, which will help you catch up with the course content when required. As a reference, you can also refer to the book by J.N. Reddy. It's a really good book on continuum mechanics fundamentals. There's a couple of extra resources available in terms of courses at other universities as well as YouTube lectures. So please feel free to browse them as well. So lecture notes and slides will be uploaded on the course website. So please see the link that is available below in this YouTube lecture to go to our course website. Now, before we start looking at what continuum mechanics is, let us get an appreciation of what are the application areas of this field. So continuum mechanics has applications going from engineering, medicine, all the way to sciences. I've only put a couple of applications on this slide because the number of applications are so many. So it has applications in sports. So any sport that has aerodynamics, balls involved, this field is quite useful. It's at the heart of it. Mechanical engineering, be it automobiles, be it energy production, you have continuum mechanics everywhere. Applications such as bulletproof vests, for example, these are state-of-the-art applications of this field where you have non-Newtonian fluids which are used, which thicken when the shear increases on them, and they're really interesting and complex fluids which again have continuum mechanics at the heart of them. Interesting applications like computer gaming, augmented reality, crowd management, all also have continuum mechanics linked to them indirectly. Now, classical applications such as weather modeling, biomechanics, surgeries, cryosurgery, laser surgery again have continuum mechanics in the heart of them. Even applications such as LIGO observatory, which is Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory to detect gravitational waves, has applications of quantum mechanics. Diffusion tensor imaging, tensor-based morphometry, advanced materials such as haptics for sensing touch, hardware cooling and electronics, all of them have quantum mechanics again at the heart of them. So this field, all in all, is almost everywhere. So understanding quantum mechanics is going to be a very useful experience for all of you. Now let's try to understand what is the meaning of continuum mechanics. So let's look at the mechanics part first. So mechanics, as we all know, is nothing but the study of motion of bodies under the action of external forces. So we have been talking about point mass theory, which is the first theory you learned in mechanics, where all the masses were modeled as point masses. So the shape and the size of the masses did not matter at all. So in these cases, you had, even though it was a box or a monkey, all of them were considered as point masses. And then you found out the net force acting on them as well as the resultant acceleration because of those forces. Then we slowly graduated towards rigid body mechanics, where the size of the size and the shape of the body started to matter. And this is where we defined quantities like moment of inertia. But then that is still not complete, because the real bodies, solid bodies for example, they do deform. So how do we quantify the deformation in these bodies to be able to analyze these mechanics effectively? So that is where continuum mechanics comes to our help. So continuum mechanics is the study of deformation or the rate of deformation in fluids. For example, when you apply shear to fluids, the fluids start deforming continuously. So in this course, we'll be talking about the response of solids and fluids to external stresses being applied on them. And we'll be particularly focusing on the deformation and rate of deformation rather than the average motion. So what we'll do is we'll come up with metrics which will help us subtract the mean motion of the system, and we only look at the relative motion between the particles in the system. The next thing we'll want to understand is what is the meaning of the word continuum in continuum mechanics. So the word continuum comes from the Latin word continuous with a W, that means being together. Although the atoms and molecules fill the space discretely, however, for engineering analysis, we can assume that the matter fills the space continuously, and this is where the word continuum comes into the picture. Now, let us take an example. So if we have, let us say, a cube in space, and let the dimension of the cube be a very small dimension. So let us take a cube which has a side of the order of 1/100th of a millimeter. It's a tiny cube. Now this cube typically at standard temperature and pressure will have of the order of 10 to the power of 10 molecules in it. So if you have air around you at standard temperature and pressure, then you will end up having 10 billion molecules of air in this tiny little cube that you have considered. Now definitely the engineering applications we look for will be at a scale which are much larger than these 1/100th of a millimeter or 10 microns. So what we see is that the physical quantities, which ultimately are defined using the molecules inside the cube, can be defined continuously. So we can average out the information in these tiny cubes and we can define physical quantities. And this will let us define physical quantities at a point. So we'll call these physical quantities point functions, although they are defined as an average of a collection of molecules inside a box. So hence physical quantities like density, velocity, stress, temperature, etc. can now be defined continuously, because any volume we take, the smallest of the smallest volumes, will have enough number of molecules to define these quantities continuously. And we'll also assume that these quantities have continuous derivatives, which will help us write the equations of motion for these physical variables. Now the question comes, can we apply the continuum concept all the time? And the answer is no. The reason being that it's a matter of scientific experience whether you have enough number of molecules inside the smallest volumes. For example, let's take the case of the design of a vacuum chamber. So vacuum chambers by definition are chambers which have very few molecules in them, so that you have a very low pressure or almost a vacuum. So if you're talking about a vacuum chamber, then you definitely would want to have less number of molecules. So the smallest volumes we take will actually end up having very few molecules. So for that we have a non-dimensional number called the Knudsen number, denoted by Kn, which is defined as the ratio of the mean free path to an average length in the domain. So we'll call it a characteristic length. So this L is for this case can be assumed as the size of the box. So let's say that we are talking about we can assume the same box. So we can assume this box. So the smallest of the smallest volumes we are interested in has a size of the dimension L, in this case 1/100th of a millimeter, and lambda, which is the mean free path, is nothing but an average distance a molecule travels before it collides with another molecule or the wall. So in this example we have, let's say, a few number of molecules, and lambda will then become the effective or the approximate or the average length or distance a molecule travels before it ends up colliding with something else. So this ratio of lambda to L is called the Knudsen number, and if you are talking about a very rarefied gas system, then this ratio will become really small. This ratio will in that case becomes really large, because your lambda will increase as the number of molecules in the box reduces. So we typically, from our experience, we will say that if the Knudsen number is small, let's say is less than 0.01, in that case we can assume the continuum theory to be valid. So as I said, that it's a matter of scientific experience. So however, in this course, since we are developing the theory of mechanics, so we will assume that continuum mechanical theory is valid. So let's quickly browse through the course content for this course. So let us quickly browse through the course content for this course. So we'll be starting with a discussion of the mathematical fundamentals of mechanics, continuum mechanics, and this involves a lot of discussion on tensors. So tensors for many of you will be something new. It's a new mathematical object that we'll be requiring to define our physical and geometrical quantities. So we'll be talking about notations. We'll be talking about the algebra of tensors. We'll be talking about the application of using tensors in matrices and determinants. And then finally we'll be talking about transformation laws and the calculus of tensors. So we'll be involving tensors in the calculus for writing the differential equations. Now then we'll be talking about stresses. So stresses are equivalent to forces in classical mechanics, or I shouldn't use the word classical mechanics, I should say traditional mechanics that we've been talking about. So we'll be talking about the definition of stress. We'll be talking about equilibrium equations, which helps us apply stresses to certain applications of equilibrium, the symmetry of stress tensor, the principal stresses. We'll also be talking about the spherical and deviatoric parts of this stress tensor. Then we'll move to strains. So strains are equivalent to displacements in traditional mechanics. So in strains we'll be talking about the configurations, how bodies go through different configurations to help us define deformations. We'll be talking about some coordinate systems which help us easily write the equations of motion. And then we'll be talking about things like material derivatives, rate of deformation and deformation, which help us quantify the motion in fluids and solids respectively. Finally, once we have an understanding of stresses and strains, we'll be talking about conservation laws, the laws of conservation of mass, momentum and energy, and these will then involve displacement as well as stress terms, which ultimately will help us write the equations of motion. Finally, we'll be talking about the role of constitutive law, because as we know that the the resultant motion of a body is not only a function of the stresses acting on it, it's also a function of the constitutive behavior. That is, let's say a steel ball, if you apply the same sort of force to it, will end up deforming less as compared to a rubber ball. So we'll see how the material constitution is taken into account when talking about the equations of continuum mechanics. And at the very end, we will take an application of continuum mechanics, particularly in fluid dynamics applications, just to appreciate the importance of this field and how this field can be applied to real world problems. Well, I would want you to stay motivated. There's plenty of content available on the internet to read about the applications of this field. You can go through popular science magazines which talk about the latest developments in the field of science and technology involving continuum mechanics. I'll also recommend you go through history of science, which is quite interesting, because when you're studying science, you should know how this field has evolved over the last many decades. So I'll recommend particularly the book on history of mechanics, which also is available on the internet. Well, my expectations from this course, from you, are that you should enjoy the course. It's really important you enjoy this course, otherwise there's no point going through it. And always remember that ideas do matter. So although we'll be talking about a lot of equations, but there is a hidden physical idea behind each equation, and we will try to discuss most of them, but always try to understand those ideas. And it is these ideas that will stay with you rather than the actual equations, which definitely you can recall if you understand how they were derived. But the ideas are the most important aspects of this course, especially at this undergraduate stage. Please feel free to ask questions. Since this is an online course, you can email me the question at gaurav@iitmandi.ac.in. I will definitely reply you back as soon as possible. And I'll suggest you follow the order of lectures. Don't try to skip lectures, because the content is quite linear, so we'll expect that you have understood the previous lectures in order to understand the future ones. Try to link the ideas that you learn to real world applications. It's really important because this is an engineering course, so you should definitely look for applications and real life applications, technological solutions that you see around you, how you can apply the ideas of continuum mechanics into either improving them or developing them. Well, at the end of the course, I would want you to have learned something new, be it just the mathematics of tensors or the understanding of stress and strain relationships. So that is it with the introduction of continuum mechanics. Let's get started with tensors. So in this first discussion on tensors, today we'll be talking about the definition of tensors, so what tensors are. We'll be talking about a couple of applications of tensors. In fact, we'll be talking about the definition starting with certain simpler examples, and then we'll also be talking about certain notations related to tensors, which will help us write tensorial equations. So let's start with the most simplest example of a tensor, which you already know, and it is called scalars. So we know that scalars are objects, mathematical objects, which only require a number to quantify them. And as an example, we know temperature or distance. So these quantities only require one number, although they may or may not have a unit associated with them, but that's simply a number to quantify them or characterize them. So let's take an example of temperature. So if I measure the temperature at this point in space at this particular time, all I will get is a number. So let's say in this case we get 25 degree centigrade. So that's the temperature at this particular point in space and time. So that's simply a scalar. Sometimes we get confused with scalars and constants. So let's clarify that before we move ahead. Now, a constant is something that does not change, so it's constant. But temperature, which is a scalar in this case, will change. I mean, if I move to different parts of the room, I may get different temperature. In fact, at different times, the temperature will evolve. It will get colder as we get the night, and it'll start becoming hotter as the sun rises. So temperature is a function of position, coordinate, and time. So these quantities, which are functions of position and time, we call them fields. Okay. So in this case, we'll be calling temperature as temperature field. So this becomes our temperature field. So just to clarify certain concepts, so don't confuse a constant with a scalar. Okay, these are two mutually independent ideas. Anyways, coming back to scalars. So scalars are the most simplest example of tensors, and they are called 0th order tensors. Okay, so the next example we'll take is vectors. Are first order tensors. Again, we have quite a good understanding of vectors. So loosely speaking, vectors are quantities which require a direction as well as magnitude to characterize them. So we need a direction, magnitude. Okay, examples are, well, the most simplest one, velocity, displacement, force. So these are typical examples of vectors, because you can you require a direction as well as magnitude to characterize them. Now vectors are mathematical objects. Okay, so if you have a physical quantity, let's take force for example. If I can do the mathematics of vectors and get the same physical ideas, get physical results as we get in forces, we call this object a vector. So for something to be a vector, it has to satisfy the mathematical law of vector addition, or you've heard that as the triangle vector addition law. So if it satisfies, if the physical quantity satisfies the triangle vector addition law, then that physical quantity can be denoted by a vector. A really non-intuitive example of vectors is rotation. So if you have rotation, let's say counterclockwise rotation happening, a disk is rotating, then you know that using the right hand thumb rule, you can say that it can be associated with a vector which is pointing out of this plane of board. So we denote that by a dot. Now intuitively, a rotation is not a vector pointing out of the plane of the board, but what we see is that if we add rotations, if we rotate a body in this plane and rotate a body in a perpendicular plane, we'll end up getting a sort of rotation which is 45 degrees if the rotations are equal to the two planes. So what we see is that rotations add like vectors because they follow the vector addition law, hence they are vectors. So for a quantity to be a vector, it has to satisfy the properties associated with vectors mathematically, and these properties are called the triangle vector addition law. Okay. And we again have an understanding that in a three-dimensional world, we need three independent components to describe a vector. So if I was to say velocity, then velocity vector will be described using three components, v1, v2 and v3. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Now that we understand 0th and first order tensors, let's go to higher order tensors. In fact, let's go to an nth order tensor. Now an nth order tensor will require 3 to the power of n components to describe it. Okay, so if n is 0, it's a 0th order tensor. 3 to the 0, that's one component, a scalar. If n is 1, then we require 3 components, that's a vector. And remember that we have a 3 here because we are in a 3-dimensional world. So it's x, y, z, 3-dimensional world. So we require 3 to the power of n components to describe it. Now, would that mean that anything which has 3 to the power of n components is an nth order tensor? The answer is no. Okay, just like vectors, tensors have to satisfy a certain mathematical property. So if that mathematical property is being satisfied, only then we can denote that physical or geometrical quantity using a tensor. And that the property is called the transformation property. Okay, so we'll talk about this transformation property in the next, after a couple of lectures. Loosely speaking, if you have a tensorial object, let's say stress. Okay, so again we'll talk about it later, but an example of an second order tensor is stress. So we denote it as sigma ij. It's a second order tensor. So if I take this quantity stress, then if I transform my spatial coordinates, so if I, loosely speaking, if I look at it from a different angle, then it should have the new components of that quantity should agree with the mathematical transformation property for second order tensors. Only then we can call it a tensor. If it does not satisfy those properties physically, then it's not a tensor. Okay, we'll not talk about this property at this point of time, but we'll discuss in detail about this property in a couple of lectures from now. Now that we have a definition of tensors, an nth order tensor which has 3 to the power of n components, let's talk about a bit of a notation as to how do we write these using symbols. So now that we have talked about the definition and examples of tensors, let's talk about notation. For the case of scalars, we are used to writing them as lowercase Greek alphabets or lowercase English alphabets, alpha, beta, A, B, and so on. So it's simply an alphabet. For vectors, so I'll say first order, and this is 0th order. For vectors, we are used to writing that velocity, for example, is v with an arrow on the top. We sometimes also write some bold case symbol. So let's say force as a bold case symbol, that's a vector again. So these are two typical notations we use for writing vectors. In fact, sometimes we end up expanding the vector. So in a 3-dimensional world, we'll write v1, v2, v3 as 3 components of this vector. Or in some cases, we write them as a linear combination of the basis vectors. So we basically write this notation in an expanded form. So we write v1 e1 plus v2 e2 plus v3 e3, where e1, e2 and e3 are unit vectors in the x, y and z directions. So in a 3-dimensional right-handed Cartesian coordinate system with O as the origin, you have the x1, x2 and x3 axis. So in this course in continuum mechanics, we will be using x1, x2 and x3 rather than using the x, y and z notation. It's just a notational preference. So this, a unit vector in this direction simply becomes e1, e2, and in the x3 direction it becomes e3. So we tend to write the vectors as a linear combination of its components in the linear combination of the 3 basis vectors, with the components written as the coefficient of each basis vector. Okay, so these are different notations of writing vectors. Now when we write second or higher order tensors, so let's call second order first, because we'll be dealing a lot with second order tensors as compared to higher order tensors. Second order tensors typically are written, stress for example, we tend to write that as sigma ij with angle brackets around it. So that's one notation. We also write it as sigma with two lines on top of it, and you'll also see sometimes sigma written in bold. Okay. So these are all notations we use to write second order tensors. The most common one, and the one that we'll be referring to in this course, is going to be this one, which has two indices below it. So these I and j are called indices. Okay. And because of this notation which has indices below it is called the indicial notation. Okay. So we'll write it here on the left hand side. So this is called the indicial notation because we use the subscript indices to use that to refer to that quantity. So in this indicial notation, we can also write our vectors, because vectors are nothing but a special case of tensors. So vectors, in this case, let's say v, can be written as vi with angle brackets. That denotes a vector. In fact, it's not quite common to use angle brackets. We simply write vi, and that will end up meaning a vector. So how do we figure out if it's a vector that is a first order tensor or a second order tensor or higher order tensor? It's the number of indices that it has. Okay. So let's create some space on the board to discuss that further. So now that we have some space on the board, let's talk about an indicial notation. So in this indicial notation, as we said that we use subscript indices to denote the vector or sorry, the tensor. So if we have a vector, we will write that as vi. It has one index I, so that's an index, and this index can take values from 1 to 3. So I goes from 1 to 3. So I can be either 1, 2 or 3, and it's going from 1 to 3 because we're talking about a three-dimensional world. So as we said, we have a three-dimensional right-handed three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system. So we have x1, x2 and x3 as our 3 dimensions. So we'll have components in these 3 dimensions. So we have a vector with an index. So we have a quantity with an one index, that's a vector. Now for a tensor, which is, let's say, second order, we use a lowercase Greek symbol, sigma in this case, and we have 2 indices. Now these 2 indices can independently go from 1 to 3. So I goes from 1 to 3 and j goes from 1 to 3. So what we see is that we have a total of 9 components here, sigma 1 1, sigma 1 2, sigma 1 3, all the way to sigma 3 3. So we have a total of 9 components. Okay. Now for an nth order tensor, since it's an nth order tensor, we'll have n components. So let's say we write that as I, j, k dot 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 n, where, well, let's use m here. Let's not confuse the number of indices with an index id. So we have a total of n indices. So the number of these subscripts is n in this case. So if we have that, then as we know that each index can independently go from 1 to 3, so we have a total of 3 to the power of n components in this case. Okay, so it's very easy to use the indicial notation to write the to denote the different components of a tensor. The other notation that's very popular, slightly less popular than the initial notation, is called the symbolic notation. The symbolic notation is the one where you have your vector v written in bold, or your sigma written in bold, or the vector v with an arrow on the top, or a sigma with 2 lines on the top. So in this course we will not be using the symbolic notation, or we will be using the symbolic notation just a couple of times. Mostly we'll be using the initial notation. Initial notation is able to convey the information more easily. In fact, there is a lot more we can do with the initial notation in terms of the algebra as compared to the symbolic notation. So we'll stick with initial notation, and that this notation is going to be a bit new to you, but as we do more and more problems, you will get quite comfortable with this notation. So I'll suggest that you practice lots of problems that we'll be discussing in the future to get comfortable with this new notation. Before we close this lecture, I would just want to expand on this notation a bit for first order tensors, that is vectors. So let's do that. So initial notations for vectors. Now vectors, let's take the vector, velocity vector in this case. We tend to write that as v1 e1 plus v2 e2 plus v3 e3, where e1, e2 and e3 are unit vectors in x1, x2 and x3 directions respectively, and v1, v2 and v3 are the components of this vector, or the projection of this vector in the corresponding directions. Now I have the summation notation, so I can write this as simply summation I goes from 1 to 3 vi. Okay. So I'm sure we are comfortable with this summation notation. So this sum means that I do a sum over this by varying the value of I from 1 to 3. So it's v1, it's vi ei. I'm sorry for that. So this notation means that simply when I expand this, I get this quantity which has 3 terms being added individually. While Einstein was working on his theory of relativity, he was dealing a lot with tensors, and the board got quite cluttered when he was doing his derivations and calculations, as you may have seen in pictures of Einstein with this huge board with lots of mathematical terms written in it. So while he was doing this, he came across something like this. Well, not exactly this, but something like this. And then he thought that what if, to save space, I simply get rid of the summation. So what he said was, let us remove the summation. But removing the summation is just for convenience. Ultimately, this term has to mean the same thing as this expanded form. So he came up with a rule that we call the summation convention or Einstein notation. So this led to a rule called the Einstein notation or the summation convention. Okay, so this rule that Einstein invented helped us to write this sum of 3 quantities simply by writing vi ei. So we'll stop here, and in the next lecture we'll start discussing how this sum of 3 terms is equal to this term in the Einstein notation. Thank you.